March 1945. The Rhine lies before the Allies like a wound carved across the map of Europe, broad, cold, and swift under the grey sky of a dying empire. It is more than a river now. It is Germany's last wall, the ancient moat of the Reich, and the final line between defeat and the illusion of survival. On its eastern banks, the cities of the heartland still smolder, and somewhere beyond them, Berlin. Adolf Hitler calls it destiny's gift. He assures his generals that no army will ever cross it alive. The bridges that once connected Germany to the world are gone, blown skyward in thunder and flame. The Rhine's currents run choked with wreckage, steel, timber, the twisted remains of retreat. Every crossing point has been mined, wired, and catalogued for destruction. Along the west bank, German troops dig in, certain that nature herself now stands in uniform. Across the river, the armies of the United States, Britain, and Canada halt. Exhausted armor idles in mud. Columns of men stare across the water that seems to mock their advance. The Rhine is not wide by map, barely 1,000 feet in most places, yet it might as well be an ocean. The war that moved so fast across France now hesitates. No bridge, no crossing, no plan that promises success. In command tents, engineers unfold their maps in silence. They measure current speed, bank gradient, soil firmness, data replacing hope. Somewhere among them, the quiet conviction forms that the war will be won not by soldiers alone, but by builders. But for now, no one moves. From Berlin, the propaganda machine roars. German radio jeers across the frequencies. Let them learn to swim. The message reaches the front lines, carried by laughter that feels forced. To the men waiting on the western shore, it sounds almost ancient. The arrogance of an empire that still believes walls can hold back time. Night falls on the Rhine. Searchlights sweep its restless surface. On both sides, history seems to pause, unsure of its next sentence. But what neither side yet knows is that within days, the silence of the engineers will break, and the river that divided Europe will become the bridge that ends the war. For centuries, the Rhine had been more than water. It was a frontier of the mind, the line between what Europe was and what it feared to become. From the Romans who failed to tame it, to Napoleon whose eagles faltered before it, the river stood as Germany's eternal sentinel. It had guarded kingdoms, witnessed empires rise and fall, and carried legends along its current. Now, in the winter of 1945, it carried the weight of Hitler's last hope. The Allies approached its western shore with reverence and unease. Every general knew its reputation. The French had bled for it in 1918. Napoleon's armies had drowned in its floods. The British and Americans studied those histories not as relics, but as warnings. To cross the Rhine was not only to defeat Germany, it was to break the spell of centuries that declared the river uncrossable by force. In a cold office near Versailles, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower read report after report of failed crossings, of bridges blown before completion, of engineers lost to current and shellfire. Yet his conclusion was simple. If the river could not be crossed by ordinary means, then extraordinary means must be invented. His orders went out across every army group. Prepare bridging units for any chance, any hour. He knew that the moment opportunity appeared, hesitation would mean weeks lost and lives with them. Across Belgium and France, workshops echoed with the sound of construction. Pontoon sections, Bailey trusses, and assault boats were loaded onto rail cars. Combat engineers, men who built as they fought, drilled through the rain. They practiced night assembly under simulated artillery, fitting iron and timber by touch alone. Each exercise carried the same unspoken truth. When the real crossing came, there would be no second attempt. In the damp forests of the Ardennes, teams rehearsed bridging drills beside streams and canals. Officers timed every movement, counting seconds like heartbeats. 100 feet of river became 1,000. Every bolt, every cable, every beam was numbered, catalogued, rehearsed until the process became instinct. For these soldiers, construction was combat. They would not fire the first shot across the Rhine, but their hands would decide who reached the far bank alive. At headquarters, logisticians studied tables rather than maps. A single bridge across the Rhine, they calculated, could advance the Allied timetable by weeks, perhaps end the war before summer. Supplies, armor, fuel, field hospitals, all of it hinged on the question of crossing. To them, victory was measured not in divisions, but in tonnage. Their battlefield was arithmetic. Meanwhile, across the river, the German command drew comfort from the water's width. To them, the Rhine was still a moat that no modern army could span. They imagined that even if the Allies reached it, months of preparation would follow before any attempt at crossing. Their belief hardened into policy. Reinforcements were sent elsewhere. Defenses grew thin. The idea of the Rhine as an impassable shield had become a kind of faith, and faith, in war, is often fatal. In their bunkers, generals spoke of the river as though it were alive, a faithful servant of the fatherland, unchanging, invincible. They forgot that faith can blind as easily as it can inspire. On the western shore, the engineers packed their crates and waited for orders. The bridges they built in training grounds would soon be tested in the storm of real fire. Somewhere along the 820 miles of the Rhine, chance would offer them a moment, brief, dangerous, and decisive. No one knew when or where it would come. But in the silence before dawn, among the tools and the maps, the dream of crossing had already begun to take shape. And far downriver, in a town called Remagen, a bridge that should not have existed still stood against the wind. By early 1945, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had become something new, something the world had never seen before. They were soldiers, yes, but their battlefield was made of steel and mud. They fought with bulldozers instead of rifles, with cranes instead of cannons. Wherever the front advanced, they followed, rebuilding roads faster than the enemy could destroy them. Their creed was simple. If it could be built, it could be won. The American war machine had learned a lesson that Europe had forgotten, that victory in modern war depended not only on bravery, but on method. Across England, France, and Belgium, training camps became laboratories of precision. Under cold floodlights, engineers rehearsed bridge construction as infantry drilled for attack. Theirs was a choreography of iron, pins aligned, trusses raised, pontoons locked. 1,000 feet of structure, assembled from numbered parts, could span a river before sunrise. The Bailey Bridge became their signature, a modular lattice of steel plates and panels, light enough to carry by truck, strong enough to bear a tank. The men could build it blindfolded. Training films showed how an entire crossing could rise in 24 hours, each man performing his task in sequence, the process refined to a science. Speed is safety, one manual warned, and safety is victory. Every bridge began its life thousands of miles away. In American factories, women marked components with stenciled numbers, the alphabet of war industry. Shipyards along the Atlantic coast loaded crates labeled Section A1 through Z12. To an untrained eye, it was meaningless. To a combat engineer, it was the anatomy of progress. Every piece destined for a field where time itself was the enemy. German intelligence took notice. Reports filtered back to Berlin describing mechanical armies that manufacture roads. Reconnaissance photos showed bridges appearing overnight, where hours before there had been nothing but water and mud. The analysts laughed. They called it an exaggeration of Allied propaganda, a trick of aerial photography. No one believed that an army could build as fast as it fought, but the evidence grew harder to ignore. In France, engineers restored destroyed railways in days, not months. In Belgium, they erected depots the size of cities, each filled with fuel, rations, and ammunition. The German General Staff, obsessed with defense, could not imagine an army whose greatest weapon was logistics. They still saw war in terms of divisions and guns, not man-hours and machinery. To the Americans, construction itself had become a form of combat. When German artillery shattered a bridge, engineers did not retreat. They rebuilt it under fire. Men carried girders across mud under bombardment, hammering bolts in rhythm with the explosions. Their courage was measured not in charges, but in endurance. They proved that war could be fought with calculation as much as chaos. Behind every tank advance, behind every infantry assault, lay the unseen triumph of these builders. Their tools clattered through the night as guns thundered beyond the horizon. They were anonymous, methodical, and relentless. In a war famous for destruction, they created. In their hands, steel was not only armor, it was faith made visible. By March, entire rivers had vanished from the map. What had once been obstacles were now extensions of the road network. The Rhine, that ancient symbol of German strength, was next. The engineers had prepared for it without knowing its name, building the bridges of tomorrow, one simulation at a time. In Berlin, laughter still filled the briefing rooms. The idea that Americans could conjure a bridge across the Rhine overnight was absurd, an engineer's fantasy, an impossibility. But impossibilities have a habit of appearing first in the minds of those who build them, and at Remagen, that idea was already waiting for its hour. February 1945. The Western Front no longer exists as a line. It is a blur of retreat and pursuit. Cities that once stood for centuries now burn to ash. Cologne falls after weeks of artillery fire, its cathedral still standing amid the ruin like a survivor of another age. Through its shattered streets, American armor rumbles eastward, chasing an enemy that is running out of land to defend. Ahead lies the Rhine, broad, swollen with spring melt, its current fast and merciless. For the German command, it is the last thread holding together a collapsing empire. They tell themselves it will save them, as it always has. But rivers have no loyalties. Orders go out from Berlin, destroy every bridge. From the Swiss border to the North Sea, more than 60 crossings are wired with explosives. Columns of engineers, now soldiers by necessity, crawl beneath girders, attaching charges to joints older than many of the men themselves. Bridges built for trade, for connection, are turned into weapons of delay. The Allies know this, and they hurry. Artillery shells crash into river towns to prevent demolitions. Fighter bombers sweep low, hunting for convoys of engineers carrying detonators. The race is not only for ground, but for time. Each bridge still standing is a question. How long before it vanishes into the river? As the German army retreats, its discipline unravels. Refugees pour toward the crossings. Mothers, children, wounded soldiers limping on crutches, all seeking escape from the western firestorm. Carts clog the roads, trucks jam the approaches, and in the confusion, demolition teams cannot reach their targets. Chaos, the enemy of precision, begins to work against Germany itself. At Remagen, a small town nestled between hills and the river, stands the Ludendorff Bridge, a steel relic from 1918, built during the First World War for a war that ended too late. Its twin towers rise above the Rhine like the remains of an old fortress. Designed for trains and troop movements, It has survived air raids and sabotage, its foundations scarred but unbroken. In theory, it should have been destroyed days ago. Charges have been placed, wires checked, yet the final order never quite reaches the right hands. Communications falter. Commanders argue over priorities. To some, the bridge is already irrelevant. The Allies are still miles away, and the river will stop them long before they arrive. To others, it is an escape route they may soon need themselves. The hesitation lasts hours, but in war, hours can become history. On the western horizon, American artillery flashes like summer lightning. Forward elements of the U.S. First Army press through the hills toward the river, their maps now marked not with cities, but with crossings. Somewhere among those red circles, Remagen waits. For the German High Command, this collapse is more than military. It is spiritual. The West Wall, once heralded as impregnable, has crumbled in weeks. Every mile lost west of the Rhine feels like a betrayal of faith. In Hitler's headquarters, disbelief hardens into fury. He demands to know why the Rhine is not yet secure. No one dares tell him that much of it no longer is. As night falls, demolition crews continue their work under lantern light. The wind off the water smells of cordite and mud. Across the bridge, the retreat continues. Trucks, horse carts, men with blank faces. Above them, steel cables hum in the cold air, each one marked for destruction. When dawn comes, the last German soldiers cross to the east bank. The engineers prepare to ignite the charges that will erase the bridge from the map. But the river has other plans, and so does fate. Far to the west, the sound of engines grows louder. American armor is on the move. And among the hills above Remagen, someone will soon see a shape that should not exist, a bridge still standing where none were meant to remain. By the first week of March 1945, the American advance had become something beyond planning. It was momentum itself. The 9th Armored Division, part of the U.S. First Army, was pushing faster than orders allowed, sweeping through the Rhineland in a blur of mud, smoke, and disbelief. Their mission was simple: reach the Rhine, secure crossings if they existed, and wait for engineers to catch up. But the front had become fluid, and in war, speed often finds what strategy cannot. Lieutenant Karl H. Timmermann led a small reconnaissance platoon from Task Force Engermann. Born to a German immigrant family, he had grown up hearing stories of the Rhine. Now he was approaching it with a rifle in hand. His orders were routine: probe the roads toward Remagen and report enemy strength. Yet as his half-tracks crept over the ridgeline, what he saw defied every expectation of the campaign. Below lay the town of Remagen, a quiet smear of grey roofs along the west bank of the Rhine. Beyond it, framed against the water and smoke, stood the Ludendorff Bridge. Intact, 2 great stone towers anchored its ends, with steel trusses stretching in an arc across the river. It looked like a skeleton from another war, which in truth it was. Built in 1918, it had survived air raids, neglect, and retreat. By every rule of German doctrine, it should already have been rubble. Timmermann radioed the discovery back to headquarters. The line crackled with disbelief. "Repeat that," came the reply. "You're sure it's standing?" He was sure. Through his binoculars, he could see trucks still crossing, German troops retreating in chaos. The bridge groaned under their weight. Smoke drifted from both ends where engineers had begun wiring charges. Every second mattered. Down below, confusion reigned among the defenders. The local garrison had orders to blow the bridge, but their commanding officers were missing, killed, or cut off in the retreat. Explosives had been hastily set, but not properly connected. Firing circuits tangled in the debris of bombardment. The last functioning detonation box had been struck by artillery the night before. The Rhine, meant to be a shield, had become a trap. Meanwhile, on the American side, Colonel Leonard Engerman, commander of Combat Command B, listened to the reports and made his decision. His division was not supposed to cross the Rhine. That was a task reserved for another day, another order. But opportunity does not wait for procedure. "Take that bridge," he said. The phrase was quiet, almost routine, yet it marked one of the most audacious commands of the war. At 15 Hussars hours, the first American tanks rolled onto the ridge above Remagen. Below them, German engineers were still working frantically, hammering detonators into place as shells burst around them. Civilians fled through the streets. Church bells lay shattered in their towers. The air was filled with the crackle of gunfire and the deeper thunder of artillery echoing off the water. The Americans could see flashes at the bridgehead. The Germans were preparing to destroy it. Radio silence held. The lead tank commander waited for confirmation. None came. Instead, he heard only the distant rumble of the river and the instinct that history does not give second chances. Engines roared. The Shermans descended toward the town. Infantry followed close behind, crouched low against the walls. In the chaos, the Germans finally triggered the charges. A dull explosion rolled across the valley. Smoke erupted, girders shuddered, but when it cleared, the bridge still stood. The blast had been too weak, the wiring faulty, the timing lost. Fate had given the Americans a door into the heart of Germany. Timmerman's men reached the edge of town and took up firing positions. Through the dust, the Ludendorff Bridge loomed, trembling but alive. Across its iron span, the road to victory waited, open and undefended. No one had expected to find it. No one had planned for this moment. And yet, within the next hour, the Rhine, that ancient barrier, would face its greatest test. For the order had been given, and the builders were on their way. The order went out in a voice almost calm. "Take that bridge." Within minutes, calm became motion. Engines roared to life, gears ground against metal, and the town of Remagen filled with the rising thunder of an American armored column descending toward history. Sherman tanks led the way, their turrets swinging side to side, muzzles searching for the unseen. Infantrymen followed on foot, hunched beneath the recoil of distant artillery. The air was thick with dust and burning timber. Somewhere ahead, beyond the haze and the shouting, the Ludendorff Bridge still stood. German defenders fought in fragments, rear guards firing from cellars, snipers in the towers, machine guns flaring from shattered windows. But their line was breaking faster than orders could reach them. Across the river, engineers worked frantically to finish what they had begun, the destruction of the bridge that should already have been gone. At 1550, the first charges detonated. A column of smoke rose from the western arch, debris raining into the Rhine. The blast echoed off the cliffs like a closing door. When the haze lifted, disbelief spread through both sides. The bridge was wounded, but alive. The charges had been laid too shallow. Their cables, frayed by artillery fragments, had misfired. Fate had intervened through error. The Shermans reached the edge of the riverfront. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman dismounted and surveyed the scene. The span before him trembled, pocked with holes, but it still joined the two halves of a collapsing world. Somewhere on the far bank, German engineers scrambled to reset fuses. Riflemen fired wildly through the smoke. Timmerman made the decision that history would remember. He ordered his men forward. The first wave sprinted across. Bullets struck the decking, ricocheting off twisted plates. The bridge shook underfoot, not from explosives this time, but from the sheer weight of courage. Engineers crawled along the girders, clipping wires, tossing live charges into the water before they could ignite. Medics moved behind them, dragging the fallen aside as more men poured in. German snipers opened fire from the bridge towers. Their shots cracked through the din, forcing the Americans to crawl between steel trusses for cover. Sergeant Eugene Dorland, carrying wire cutters and nothing else, climbed through the latticework under fire, dismantling what remained of the explosive circuits. Each cut was a gamble. One wrong move could end it all. But one by one, the lines went dead. Behind them, tanks began firing suppressive rounds across the river, their shells slamming into the eastern shore. Infantry pressed forward, step by step, through smoke so dense they could no longer see the far side. To them, it felt like walking into a storm, each heartbeat a drumbeat of chance. At 16, the bridge held. Against logic, against probability, against the designs of two armies, it still stood. By dusk, a full company had reached the far bank, securing a perimeter among the ruins of Erpel. The Germans counterattacked, desperate to reclaim what their demolition had failed to erase. But the foothold was firm. By nightfall, an entire battalion of the 9th Armored Division had crossed the Rhine, the first Allied soldiers to do so in living memory. The impossible had become fact. The uncrossable river of German legend now had footprints on both shores. Behind them, the engineers worked without pause. Under the glow of tracer fire, they patched holes, reinforced beams, and stabilized the swaying structure. Every strike of a hammer was defiance. Every plank laid was prophecy. The bridge that should have been destroyed was becoming stronger under fire. Across the battlefield, German units fell back in shock. Reports to high command came garbled and disbelieved. An American bridgehead east of the Rhine. It sounded absurd, even to those reading it aloud, but absurdity was now reality. When darkness settled, the Ludendorff Bridge groaned beneath the weight of victory and fear. Its trusses, warped and bleeding rust, seemed to hold their breath. Beneath them, the Rhine carried away the wreckage of the day, broken timbers, spent casings, and the silence of disbelief. At Remagen, the river had yielded its secret. The barrier that defined centuries of German defense had been crossed not by miracle, but by timing, courage, and calculation. And deep in Berlin, a message was on its way to the Führer's bunker, a report that would ignite a fury the world would not soon forget. The message reached Berlin just before midnight, a coded signal intercepted twice and checked 3 times for accuracy, confirmed what no one in Hitler's headquarters was prepared to believe. American troops had crossed the Rhine, alive, armed, and in numbers. Not by pontoon, not by miracle, but across a bridge the Reich had sworn no enemy would ever use again. In the Führer bunker beneath the Chancellery Gardens, silence followed the report like an aftershock. The Rhine was supposed to be eternal, the ancient barrier, the natural fortress that had defended Germany since the days of the Romans. To hear that it had been crossed intact was not merely military failure, it was blasphemy. Hitler's rage came without warning. Witnesses later described it as a storm of disbelief rather than anger, a man unable to comprehend the limits of his own commands. He demanded the names of those responsible, the engineers, the bridge guards, the officers of Remagen. Within hours, orders went out for arrests, interrogations, and executions. Men who had fought to the last were condemned for surviving the wrong kind of disaster. In the situation maps before him, the Rhine was still drawn as a thick blue line. Germany's final moat, the barrier that divided the invaders from the homeland. But the line now had a hole. A single red mark, no wider than a pinhead, represented the bridgehead at Remagen. Hitler stabbed at it with his pencil and muttered, "This cannot be." Yet it was. Across Germany's command network, panic rippled outward. Generals on the Western Front argued over who had failed. Field Marshal Model, commander of Army Group B, called it a national disgrace. Rundstedt demanded immediate counterattacks. Orders clashed, radio lines filled with accusations. But behind the noise was a quiet truth. No one had a plan for this. The bridge was supposed to be gone. Within 24 hours, the order came down. Destroy it at any cost. Every weapon available was to be turned against Remagen. Fighter bombers from the Luftwaffe's few remaining squadrons were scrambled. FU-190s, Me-262 jets, even aging Stukas flown by cadets. They dove through Allied flak, dropping ordnance on the American-held bridge, only to see their bombs miss or explode harmlessly in the river below. Artillery batteries were moved within range. From the east bank, 80 mm guns and railway cannons opened fire, shelling the bridge day and night. Yet each morning, reconnaissance photos showed it still standing, scarred, smoke-streaked, but alive. The engineers on the American side were rebuilding it faster than the Germans could destroy it. Hitler ordered new tactics. Combat swimmers, Kampfschwimmer, were sent downriver with mines strapped to their chests, paddling through the freezing current toward the piers. Few returned. Some were swept away by the current. Others were cut down by machine gun fire before they reached their target. The river that once protected Germany now consumed its own defenders. As the days passed, the bridge seemed to defy not just weapons, but will. The Americans reinforced it with timber and steel, braced it with cables, and patched holes under fire. Each shell that struck the structure was answered by a hammer. For every girder shattered, 2 were replaced. The battle for the Rhine had become a battle of endurance. Germany's belief in destiny against America's belief in method. In Berlin, reports grew shorter and grimmer. The propaganda ministry struggled to hide the truth, calling Remagen a minor penetration. But inside the Wehrmacht's war rooms, officers no longer spoke of victory. The unthinkable had happened. The river had failed them. The Rhine, once a symbol of safety, had become a wound in the German psyche, bleeding pride faster than soldiers could die. Even the most hardened generals felt it. They had taught for years that the Rhine was invincible, that no enemy could bridge it under fire. Now, a single damaged span held open the gates of the Reich. The myth had shattered overnight, and with it, something deeper, the faith that had sustained the German war effort through disaster after disaster. By the end of the week, the words Remagen and Ludendorff were spoken in Berlin only with bitterness. The last illusion of control had vanished, and still, on the western horizon, the sound of Allied construction continued, rhythmic, patient, unstoppable. Because while Germany sought to destroy one bridge, the Americans were already building 5 more. At dawn on March 8, 1945, the Rhine lay shrouded in mist and gunsmoke. The Ludendorff Bridge, blackened, twisted, trembling, stood like a survivor refusing to fall. All night the Germans had shelled it. All night the engineers had fought back with hammers, torches, and bare hands. By morning, neither side had won, yet one side had already begun to build faster than the other could destroy. The bombardment was relentless. Hundreds of shells an hour rained upon the bridge and the banks around it. Every impact sent a shiver through the girders, scattering sparks and dust onto the men below. But the engineers of the U.S. First Army did not flinch. They moved like surgeons in a field hospital made of steel, patching torn planks, welding ruptured joints, dragging replacement cables through clouds of smoke. Their work was done in rhythm, the cadence of crisis. Some repaired, others ferried ammunition and supplies. Medics and welders worked side by side, the hiss of acetylene mingling with the moans of the wounded. There was no division of roles anymore, only a collective instinct to keep the bridge alive. One officer called it a living thing, breathing under strain, held together by discipline and will. The Germans, watching from across the river, could hardly believe what they saw. The bridge they had half destroyed continued to function. Every explosion that damaged it seemed answered by the sound of an engine roaring across its deck. The Americans had turned defense into construction, war into repair. By mid-morning, armored vehicles began to test the span. Engineers walked beside them, listening for stress in the beams. Some cracks were visible, others were only felt through vibration. Still, they waved the tanks forward. Each crossing was a gamble, but each successful passage strengthened belief. Then, against every expectation, the first full tank platoon rolled across the Ludendorff Bridge. The structure groaned and flexed, but did not fail. On the far bank, infantry dug in deeper, expanding the bridgehead inch by inch. What had begun as a daring raid had become an open wound in the German line, one that no amount of shell fire could close. The engineers' casualty rate climbed with every hour. Sniper fire picked them off one by one. Artillery tore holes through work crews. Yet the system did not falter. For every man killed, 2 others stepped forward. They carried replacement timbers, rewired detonated circuits, and welded in the open, their faces lit by the orange glow of molten steel. Under fire they built. To sustain the crossing, pontoon ferries began operating alongside the bridge. Rafts carried tanks, jeeps, and field guns across the river in endless loops. Within 24 hours, the bridgehead had become a machine of motion. Nearly 8,000 troops crossed by nightfall, followed by artillery and fuel trucks. Every hour tightened the American grip on the east bank. Across the Rhine, German commanders threw everything they could muster: artillery barrages, jet bombers, even rocket attacks. The Luftwaffe's Me-262s streaked overhead, dropping bombs that missed by yards. The riverbanks shook, but the bridge still held. Every weapon meant to erase it only scarred it further, turning the Ludendorff into a monument of defiance. To the soldiers crossing, it felt less like strategy and more like destiny. They could see the German homeland beyond the smoke, hills dotted with villages and spires. After years of war, the unthinkable was happening before their eyes. The Allies were on the far side of the Rhine. In the command tents west of the river, maps were redrawn. The bridgehead at Remagen was expanding too fast to measure. By the second night, tanks were streaming eastward under moonlight. The crossing that had begun with disbelief was now a highway of inevitability. As one American general later said, "The Germans had their fortress, we had our engineers." By the third day, the pattern was clear. The rhythm of construction outpaced the rhythm of destruction. The bridge was no longer a target, it was a statement. Each plank replaced under fire declared a truth that no doctrine could deny. Organization had become a form of courage. And far above the Rhine, where the smoke thinned and the air grew cold, observers could see a sight that would haunt the German command for years to come. A steady column of tanks rolling east, over a bridge that refused to die. But even the strongest steel has limits. The Ludendorff Bridge could endure only so much, and as more weight pressed upon it, the countdown to its final test had already begun. By the second week of March, the Rhine itself seemed to rise in rebellion. The Ludendorff Bridge, already scarred by 1,000 impacts, now endured the full weight of German desperation. Artillery batteries lined the eastern hills, their muzzles fixed upon the crossing. Every hour brought new salvos, hundreds of shells screaming across the river, shaking the structure until its bolts wept rust. The bridge no longer groaned, it trembled like something alive, holding its breath under fire. For the American engineers, this was no longer construction, it was endurance. They patched holes as shells fell around them, welded through smoke, and braced the girders with timber and prayer. The air stank of burning metal and wet earth. Yet the flow of war did not stop. Convoys moved across the span in disciplined rhythm. Trucks, tanks, ambulances, and ammunition trains, each vehicle trusting that the bridge would hold for one more crossing. Above them, the Luftwaffe returned for vengeance. From the clouds came the howl of jet engines. Me-262s, the last miracle weapons of a dying Reich. They dove at impossible speed, dropping bombs and cannon fire across the bridge approaches. Explosions blossomed in the water, sending walls of spray over the crossing. But again and again, the attacks missed. The jets were too fast to aim, their pilots too green to strike true. The river swallowed their fury and gave back only ripples. When air power failed, the Germans turned to the depths. Kampfschwimmer, combat divers, slipped into the freezing current at night, carrying mines strapped to their chests. They moved in silence, guided by the bridge's shadow against the stars. American sentries, scanning the surface with searchlights, caught the glint of movement. Machine guns opened up, tracer rounds stitching the water red. The survivors tried to fix their charges beneath the piers, but the current tore them away. The Rhine itself seemed unwilling to obey its defenders. Artillery fire grew heavier. Rail guns, mortars, even captured flak pieces joined the barrage. The bridge shook so violently that men on it could feel the deck shift beneath their boots. Engineers calculated stress loads between bombardments, reinforcing trusses with scavenged beams. They worked through exhaustion, deafened by the ceaseless thunder. When one crew was killed by a direct hit, another stepped forward wordlessly, tools already in hand. And still, the convoys rolled. By mid-March, more than 25,000 men and 2,500 vehicles had crossed the Rhine at Remagen. The impossible had become routine. What had begun as a single bridgehead was now a corridor of advance, America's artery into the heart of Germany. The Rhine, once a symbol of defense, had been transformed into a supply line. Furious, Hitler reached for weapons of spectacle. He ordered V-2 rockets launched against the bridge. Vengeance from the stratosphere. The missiles arced high over the clouds and fell upon the valley with terrifying silence. One struck the riverbank, carving a crater large enough to swallow a house. Others landed miles away, their explosions echoing uselessly through empty hills. None hit the target. The rockets, meant to symbolize German precision, had become instruments of futility. For the soldiers watching from the bridge, the irony was inescapable. The Reich that had once promised an unbreakable defense now flung its last inventions at a single piece of steel, and failed. The river they had feared had turned traitor, carrying not resistance, but supply, not death, but momentum. Even nature seemed to side with the builders. Fog that had once concealed German movement now cloaked the American bridgehead. Rain fell hard enough to mute the sound of engines, protecting the convoys as they crossed. The Rhine, which had stood as Germany's guardian for centuries, had quietly changed allegiance. Each day the bridge bent but did not break. Each night, the engineers returned with torches, sealing cracks and laying planks, as if defying gravity itself. The river fought back, but its strength was fading, and soon, in one final roar of defiance, it would have its revenge, not upon the enemy, but upon the very structure that defied it. March 17th, 1945. The morning began like every other in the shadow of the Rhine. Grey sky, distant thunder, and the endless echo of artillery rolling through the valleys. The Ludendorff Bridge, battered by 10 days of bombardment and strain, still stood in defiance of logic. Its girders sagged, its joints screamed under weight and fire, yet convoys continued to cross. Every vehicle that rumbled over its deck felt like a dare to gravity. Shortly after noon, the bridge reached the end of its endurance. Witnesses later said there was no single explosion, no final strike from enemy guns, only a deep, groaning sound that rose like a sigh from the earth itself. The central span shuddered once, twice, then folded inward. Steel twisted, rivets sheared free, and in less than 10 seconds, the structure that had carried an army collapsed into the river below. Dozens of soldiers were thrown into the water. Some swam clear, others vanished beneath the churning current. Engineers who had worked for days without rest were among the dead. Those who survived stood on the banks in silence, watching the river swallow the bridge they had kept alive through fire and will. For a moment, the Rhine reclaimed what had always belonged to it, but unlike every bridge destroyed before, this loss changed nothing. The crossing had already achieved its purpose. Within sight of the wreckage, 5 new bridges stood, pontoons and Bailey spans built in record time by the same hands that had held the Ludendorff together. Trucks rolled across them within hours, artillery followed by nightfall. The Rhine, once a barrier, had become a boulevard. To the Germans observing from the eastern hills, the meaning was unmistakable. The Americans did not need miracles twice. They had replaced improvisation with method, courage with system. The fall of the Ludendorff was not a setback, but a signal that even nature could not slow this machinery of organization. In Berlin, news of the collapse reached Hitler too late for satisfaction. His last hopes of halting the Allied advance had already drowned. The Rhine, his ancient moat, had been crossed in strength. Reports from the front no longer spoke of defense, only delay. Every river between the Rhine and Berlin would meet the same fate. For the U.S. First Army, the fallen bridge became a symbol rather than a loss. Engineers salvaged what they could, dragging fragments of steel ashore to study their failure. They learned from it, improved the next design, and built faster still. The rhythm of construction had outlived the structure itself. At Remagen, the ruins became both grave and monument. Debris floated downriver like relics of an age already ending. Soldiers who had crossed before the collapse spoke of the bridge as if it were alive, a comrade that had carried them as far as it could before falling. Its destruction felt less like defeat than completion. By the end of March, the bridgehead had expanded into a corridor 40 miles wide and 20 miles deep. Through it poured entire divisions, convoys, and field hospitals. The Rhine, once the wall of the Reich, now flowed beneath the wheels of its conquerors. The war was entering its final act. The Ludendorff Bridge was gone, but its lesson endured. Strength, the engineers had proven, was not in steel, but in repetition, in the quiet faith that what falls can be built again, stronger, faster, with fewer mistakes. They had turned improvisation into science, and from that science came momentum. The river had claimed its bridge, but not its meaning. What fell in steel rose again in spirit, and ahead, beyond the Rhine, the road to the heart of Germany lay open, paved not with luck, but with method. In the days after the Ludendorff Bridge fell, the war did not pause. The river crossing at Remagen had become more than a victory. It was now a machine that had to be kept alive. Every hour, men and materials flowed eastward, crossing temporary spans that replaced the fallen giant. And at the heart of this constant motion were the engineers, soldiers who fought not by killing, but by keeping order amid ruin. They were everywhere and nowhere at once. Mud-streaked, sleepless, unarmed except for tools, the engineers of the U.S. First Army worked in a rhythm that ignored fear. Under fire, they dragged pontoon sections through the current, bolted steel plates by flashlight, and rebuilt what the enemy destroyed before sunrise. Their names rarely reached the reports, but their labor did what armies alone could not. It made the impossible routine. Infantrymen who passed through the crossings began to call them the Silent Division. They rarely spoke, even less so under bombardment. Orders came through gestures, a nod, a raised hand, the clatter of a wrench against a girder. They worked through exhaustion, through shrapnel, through nights that blurred into mornings. One officer described them as men who built while dying. Shells rained down without pattern, sometimes for hours, yet the engineers did not scatter. When a section of bridge was hit, the nearest men replaced it before the smoke cleared. When cables snapped, they spliced them midstream. In the glow of welding torches, their faces appeared ghost-like, tired beyond recognition, yet utterly calm. They had turned repetition into protection. Organization had become a form of courage. To the Germans, watching from the opposite bank, it seemed a kind of madness. Captured officers later called it engineering insanity, the sight of men working in the open under direct fire, replacing beams faster than shells could destroy them. But to the Americans it was not madness at all. It was faith, not in luck, not in miracles, but in method. The war, they believed, was no longer a contest of genius, but of endurance and precision. Theirs was a new kind of heroism. Where once courage had meant charging a hill or holding a trench, it now meant standing by a bridge until the last bolt was set. Each man carried in his mind a sequence, steps memorized, tasks repeated until they were as automatic as breathing. It was that discipline, not defiance, that kept the structure standing. Night after night, they worked by the dim light of lanterns and flashlights. The sound of their tools blended with the drone of generators and the dull rhythm of artillery in the distance. Sometimes the air would fall silent, and in that silence, only the faint ringing of steel on steel could be heard, marking the heartbeat of the crossing. In the quiet moments between barrages, the engineers wrote their own doctrine, one not found in any manual. It said that order, when held long enough, could defeat chaos, that in a war defined by destruction, creation itself was the most radical act of all. As the bridgeheads expanded, generals spoke of divisions and logistics, but among the soldiers, the story of Remagen became something simpler, a tale of men who built faster than others could destroy. Steel had replaced luck as the god of war, and its priests were the engineers who served without pause or prayer. In the final weeks of the campaign, the crossings at Remagen carried hundreds of thousands of troops into the German heartland. Each convoy that rolled eastward was a tribute to those who never stopped building. They had proven that courage could wear the face of patience, that endurance could be a weapon, and that faith, not in heaven, but in craftsmanship, could change the course of history. And beyond the Rhine, the sound of hammers still echoed, the faint, enduring rhythm of a nation crossing from war into memory. By the final weeks of March 1945, the Rhine no longer marked a frontier, it marked a flow. Through the bridgeheads at Remagen, Wesel, and Oppenheim, entire armies now moved as if the river itself had turned into a road. The crossing that had begun as a gamble at a single bridge had become a torrent of motion. Armor, convoys, ambulances, and field hospitals rolling eastward in an unbroken line of steel. Remagen was no longer a place, but a process. What had started with a platoon crossing under fire now carried the weight of history itself. Thousands of vehicles crossed every day, guided by engineers who repaired each span faster than it could wear down. The river that had divided Europe for centuries now carried a single current, west to east, method to victory. On the far bank, the myth of the West Wall, Hitler's final defensive line, the Siegfriedstellung, was collapsing from within. Designed as a fortress of concrete and pride, it had once promised to hold forever. Now its bunkers stood half empty, its pillboxes abandoned. Allied armor poured through the breaches, like water finding cracks in old stone. The wall that was meant to contain Europe's greatest armies had become irrelevant before it could even fall. In the skies above, reconnaissance pilots reported the same sight from horizon to horizon: retreating columns, burning cities, bridges built anew where none had stood before. German soldiers who once fought for every meter now surrendered by the thousand. Morale, already brittle, shattered entirely when news spread that the Rhine had been crossed everywhere, not just at Remagen. The impossible had become routine. For the Allied command, it was the validation of method, of patience, organization, and faith in logistics. Each bridge built shortened the war. Each road laid under fire brought them closer to Berlin. The rhythm of victory was no longer measured in battles, but in construction schedules. For Germany, each lost crossing ended an illusion. The Rhine, once called the guardian of the Reich, had betrayed its masters. The rivers that had defended for centuries now yielded without resistance, carrying the invader deeper into the heartland. It was not treachery of geography, but of belief, the undoing of a faith in permanence. Across the ruined cities, Koblenz, Bonn, and Mainz, the old symbols of endurance lay buried beneath rubble. Church spires leaned into the smoke, their bells silenced by artillery. Columns of refugees drifted eastward, still believing in a miracle that would not come. Among them moved defeated generals, still wearing the uniforms of an empire that no longer existed. On the Allied side, the tone had changed as well. The soldiers who had once spoken of revenge now spoke of procedure. They built bridges, cleared roads, reopened rail lines. Their victory was not celebrated in shouts, but in measurements. Tons of supplies moved, miles advanced, bridges completed. For them, victory was not an emotion, it was an equation. By April, the Siegfried Line, once 400 miles of reinforced concrete, had ceased to exist as a concept. The Rhine, too, was no longer a border, but a memory. The American advance had turned the geography of Europe upside down. Defense was now defined by movement, not by walls. In Berlin, the last reports from the Western Front arrived without maps. There were no lines to draw, no front to mark, only the sound of collapse, the empire of generals giving way to the empire of engineers. The age of fortresses had ended. The age of method had begun, and across the smoking ruins of the West Wall, the same conclusion echoed from both sides of the river. Germany had built walls to stop an enemy. America had built bridges to reach an ending. The outcome was decided the moment the first bridge held. When the war ended, the bridge at Remagen was gone. Only its stone towers remained, rising above the Rhine like broken teeth. Between them stretched nothing but air and memory. The river flowed quietly again, carrying no convoys, no wreckage, no fire. Yet beneath its surface lay fragments of twisted steel, each piece a relic of the moment when human will had overruled the impossible. In the first years after the surrender, few spoke of the bridge or the men who had built and rebuilt it under fire. The world was tired of war. Victory was measured in borders, not in bolts and girders. The soldiers who crossed the Rhine returned home to ordinary lives, their names lost amid the flood of demobilization. The engineers, those quiet builders who had turned method into courage, slipped back into anonymity, carrying only the memory of what they had built and watched collapse. At Remagen, the ruins were left untouched. The two towers, once gatehouses to a dream of invincibility, stood like watchmen over an empty span. Grass grew where the bridge had fallen. Children played among the craters. In time, a small plaque was placed there, not to celebrate victory, but to mark endurance, the triumph of organization over chaos. Years later, former German officers came to the site. They walked the riverbank in silence, the weight of memory heavy but strangely calm. One of them, a veteran of the Western Command, studied the ruined towers and said quietly, "They built as if time itself obeyed them." It was not sarcasm, it was recognition that the bridge had not been merely an act of engineering, but a glimpse of a future where precision would outlast power. For historians, Remagen became more than a battlefield. It became a metaphor, the moment when civilization shifted from heroism to method, from intuition to discipline. The war that had begun in ideology ended in mathematics. The bridge was both a weapon and a prophecy, proof that the modern world would belong not to conquerors, but to those who could assemble and repair under pressure. The image of courage had changed. Once it was the soldier charging through smoke, weapon raised. Now it was the engineer tightening bolts beneath falling shells. Bravery had not disappeared. It had simply taken a quieter shape. In the century that followed, wars would still be fought, but increasingly by men and women who commanded machines, systems, and structure. Remagen had foreshadowed that transformation. To the locals, the river returned to peace. Barges passed where tanks once rolled. The towers of the Ludendorff Bridge, scarred but enduring, were turned into a museum, not of conquest, but of construction. Inside, visitors could still see the twisted beams, the faded photographs, the faces of men covered in soot and exhaustion. There were no heroes here, only workers, and that, perhaps, was the point. For the Americans who returned years later, the place carried no triumph. It was solemn, reflective, practical, just as their work had been. They had not built to prove glory. They had built to cross, to connect, to finish. The bridge's ruins remain a reminder that human progress often rises from human loss, that the measure of courage is not how loudly one fights, but how precisely one rebuilds. Remagen marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. The age of walls had fallen. The age of builders had begun. And in that quiet stretch of the Rhine, where the water moves as it always has, the echo of hammers still seems to linger, faint but steady, the sound of men who once built as if time itself obeyed them. In the end, the crossing of the Rhine was more than a military event. It was a revelation, a quiet revolution, written not in gunfire, but in blueprints, in calculations, in the rhythm of men who trusted precision more than chance. The battle for the river had proven a truth older than any empire and newer than any doctrine. Foresight defeats fortification. For centuries, Europe had been shaped by walls, castles, trenches, and rivers. Each had promised safety through immobility. But the Rhine taught the world that strength no longer lay in what stood still, but in what could move and adapt. The German generals had worshipped obstacles, believing that stone and water could hold back time. The Americans worshipped process, methodical, measurable, relentless. When the two philosophies met, one dissolved into the other like salt into water. Machines, the war had shown, obey only preparation. Not pride, not rhetoric, not symbols carved on maps. The Rhine was crossed not because of miracles, but because of checklists, the careful inventory of pontoon sections, the numbered crates of Bailey trusses, the standardized bolts that fit perfectly in the dark. It was the triumph of logistics over legend, the victory of men who planned 1,000 small details so that history could unfold in one great moment. At Remagen, each plank laid became a lesson. The crossing rewrote the doctrine of modern war. No longer would victory depend solely on generals in tents or courage in trenches. The new battlefield was organization, the alignment of machines, supply chains, and men who could think in sequence. From that point onward, wars would be won not by holding ground, but by mastering flow. For the Allies, Remagen was proof that method could outlast myth. For Germany, it was a mirror reflecting the futility of arrogance. The Reich had built fortresses, believing they could outlive human failure. But fortresses, like empires, crumble when they mistake pride for permanence. The Americans had not conquered the Rhine. They had solved it. Future armies would take note. Staff colleges from West Point to Sandhurst would study the river's crossing as a case of applied foresight. The lessons would echo through Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, wherever engineers bridged gaps faster than commanders could predict. Victory was now measurable in man-hours, in fuel consumption, in the efficiency of transport. Medals still mattered, but the men who built the bridges would become the quiet architects of every success that followed. The old idea of war, of glory, of decisive moments, began to fade with the smoke over Remagen. In its place rose something colder, more rational, but perhaps more humane, the understanding that discipline saves more lives than valor ever could. The river had shown that courage could be planned, organized, and executed, that progress itself could cross to the other side. For historians, the Rhine remains a symbol, not only of victory, but of transformation, the moment when civilization exchanged its sword for a blueprint. The same knowledge that built bridges in war would later build them in peace, connecting the broken halves of a continent once divided by ideology and steel. The lesson of the river endures, that the world moves forward not through destruction, but through design, that even amid chaos, progress is possible when faith rests in preparation, not pride. The Rhine no longer divides nations, it connects them, and in that flow, silent but unstoppable, lives the final truth of Remagen, that progress itself had crossed the river. In the winter of 1945, as snow covered the Western Front, the generals of the Reich still spoke with confidence. They believed in the river, the ancient Rhine, as they once believed in destiny. "Let them come," one said. "Let them try to cross." To them, it was not only a line on a map, but a moat carved by history itself. It had stopped kings, emperors, and revolutions. It would stop America, too. Across the water, the engineers of the U.S. Army prepared in silence. They studied current speed, bank gradients, soil types, the small, unglamorous truths that decide whether an army advances or drowns. There was no boasting, no bravado, only calculation. Where one side trusted heritage, the other trusted method. Where the Germans had faith in permanence, the Americans had faith in process. By spring, the contrast became prophecy. Out of smoke and wreckage, a bridge appeared, the Ludendorff at Remagen. It rose not by miracle, but by accident and opportunity, held together by courage and wire. What the Germans mocked as impossible had been achieved by men who built while dying, whose weapons were wrenches and torches instead of rifles. The sight of it was enough to break a legend. The Rhine, once a symbol of unyielding defense, now carried the sound of tank engines. Convoys moved across the river like an iron procession. Each vehicle that reached the far bank erased a century of military dogma. In a single week, the river that had defined European geography became a measure of speed. The invincible moat had been crossed by mathematics. Berlin refused to believe it at first. Reports of an intact bridge were dismissed as Allied propaganda. When the truth could no longer be denied, Hitler's fury became confession. His empire's faith had been built on walls, while his enemies had built tools. The German generals called it a disaster. The Americans called it logistics. In the end, Remagen was not a miracle. It was the triumph of discipline. The engineers who repaired that bridge under fire did not rely on luck. They relied on method. Every bolt tightened, every plank laid, every calculation checked was an act of quiet defiance against chaos. Theirs was a different kind of bravery, not the charge or the shout, but the steady rhythm of persistence. The lesson was unmistakable. Arrogance builds walls. Discipline builds crossings. In the age that followed, nations learned that the future belonged not to those who commanded men to fight, but to those who could organize them to build. Remagen was not only a bridge, it was a turning point in civilization's understanding of power. From that day forward, no river on earth would ever again be called uncrossable. The Rhine had taught the world that barriers, no matter how ancient, could be dismantled by knowledge. The empires of generals faded, replaced by the empires of engineers, men and women who shaped the world not through conquest, but through construction. In every modern bridge that spans a valley or a sea, there is a trace of Remagen. In every engineer who measures twice, in every worker who builds through exhaustion, in every commander who believes that order is stronger than pride. The legacy of that crossing lies not in its ruins, but in the philosophy it revealed, that progress is built, not imagined. When the war ended, the Rhine returned to quiet. The towers of the Ludendorff Bridge still stood above the current, their empty arches framing the water that once divided a continent. Tourists would come to stare at what remained, unaware that they were standing at the birthplace of a new idea, that strength is not permanence, but precision. In those final months of the war, German generals had laughed at the thought of a bridge appearing overnight. They could not imagine that method could move faster than pride. But as spring came and the smoke cleared from Remagen, they watched a river surrender to men with slide rules and grit. History remembers what followed, not the laughter, but the silence that replaced it. They laughed once, they never laughed again.